Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about some steps that the Church and we as lay in the Catholic faith can optimize the 3-year revival of the Eucharist. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut era in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Amen. Many of you know the USCCB and really the Vatican in general has done this 3-year revival of the Eucharist. And I think some of this is borne out by the stats that the Vatican has seen, that the large majority of Catholics do not believe in the real presence. It's depending on what research study that you see, it's anywhere from 70 to 80% don't believe in the real presence. Now what that means, it's really hard to know. Maybe they kind of have the more Lutheran view of consubstantiation. Who really knows? And of course, you know, it's a nuanced study, because if you ask weekly Catholic goers or Catholics who go to daily Mass a few times a week, that number, of course, is going to be much lower than 70 to 80%. But for self-identifying Catholics, it is daunting. We've talked about that and some of the other stats about what the regular lay Catholic from Our Lady of Suburbia believes in terms of homosexual marriage and contraception and the real presence and female ordination and all these things like that. By the way, the Vatican has identified that this is a problem, so they've initiated this 3-year Eucharistic revival. And we're in the middle of it. We're just entering the 2nd year. And I think this is great. I mean, it can't hurt, for certain. It's good that you're responsive. The Church sees that this is one of the problems. Let's address it. Now, what's an effective way to address it? I don't know. That's above my pay grade. That's something that the Holy Father needs to figure out. They do have a massive conference that's going to happen at the end of the 3 years. I do know, like in America, I think next summer, they're going to have a gigantic conference in Indianapolis to bring a bunch of people in, kind of like World Youth Day kind of group, but a lot of Americans are going to go to Indianapolis. And I think that's great. I do know that on the parochial level or on the parish level, I've heard of, and I haven't personally seen this on my parishes that I go to, because I go to one parish for Sunday Mass and then one for daily Mass. I've seen stuff in the bulletin, but I haven't seen it necessarily borne out, and maybe I've just missed these things, and I want to be clear about that. But I do know of some parishes around the United States that are actually doing, like we used to do on Corpus Christi, do religious processions where you bring out the monstrance with the host and you proceed through a town. I do know that in Portland, I was there recently, that they had done that, and other towns are doing that. I think that's great. How do we get people to understand the Church's teaching on the real presence? That's a good question, and I'm sure theologians in the Curia and bishops here and in other countries have thought about this. And I can just give suggestions based on my feeble knowledge of the Catholic faith, not having any degrees in theology, just from more of just kind of maybe a practical outsider perspective. What can we do? Well, it's like adult education. You see that a lot of parishes have a lot of programs for the children. And part of this is borne out because the children need to get sacramentalized. I totally think that's great. That's important. It's very important. But if we don't get the adults, we don't get the parents. Like if the parents are just dropping them off, and if the parents don't think their faith is important, why are the kids going to think it's important when they get older? And I think adult education is exceedingly important. And most parishes don't have adult education classes. And even if they did, how many parents or how many adults are really going to be going to it? Every parish has kind of like the core old people groups, right? Like the Bible study, all these groups. They're mostly the knitting group, the altar society. It's mostly elderly people. God bless them. I think that's great. How do you get to the 20, the 30, 40-something year olds who are having the children? That's a harder thing. And look, every parish is different. It varies from place to place, of course. I would say anecdotally, it seems like the more liberal parishes tend to have less of a vibrant community. And you see more of a vibrant community in the traditional communities like the Latin Mass communities or the ordinariate communities, or even some university campuses that the priests there are pretty traditional, that they'll have a very vibrant community there. Like in Texas where I live, I know Texas A&M, the Aggies, I didn't go there, so I'm not biased. They have a very vibrant community. So typically, if it's parishes that tend to, and this probably isn't shocking, stick to the history and traditions of Holy Mother Church, they tend to have a more vibrant parish, they tend to have more vocations and so forth. So it's hard to say parish to parish, but I would say as a whole, the number one thing you can do, I think, is just talk about it more at the sermon. The homily is important because that's really your big exposure to the largest majority of people that you're going to see. A priest has the biggest exposure in his homilies. Let's face it, right? Even if you have adult education classes, only a fraction of the people will be going to adult education classes. And so even those Catholics who, maybe the Christers who come twice a year, then you really got to hit it up on those 2 sermons, even if it maybe isn't the most applicable time. But definitely the Sunday Mass, you got to hit this up more. And yes, a lot of homilies are normally based on the readings. But I think if we just repeat this, especially for the next 2 years of this revival, like at least every other week, talk about it. And talk about why we believe in the real presence. Talk about the bread of life discourse in John 6. Talk about, in pretty basic terms, transubstantiation. What is it? Explain how it is a mystery of faith. How the accidentals still remain bread and wine, but the substance changes. But the more we talk about it, even if it's maybe not the best homily, but the more we talk about it, we inculcate it into the minds of the people that are listening. And of course, we recommended them. Please go read these things. Maybe read some books. Go to YouTube channels that talk about it. Go to EWTN. Go, wherever, Ascension Press. And really push. This is what the church has taught. This is what the early Christian church believed. You can read Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr, not one of the apostolic fathers, but a pivotal guy. He wrote a lot of work in the early 100s. And of course, he was martyred. He has writings talking about how the early Christian community, and he's one generation away from John the Evangelist dying, believed in the real presence. So if you build this kind of bridge of continuity, which the Catholic Church has, because we were the original church founded by Jesus Christ, and you can see century by century, we have all these writings post-Jesus, and there is no great apostasy because the writings are consistent every century to what it is today. I think that would help if you show this consistency. We've always believed this. The early church believed it. St. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians. Of course, Christ talks about it in the Last Supper. You can make the connections to the multiplication of the loaves and how that was like a precursor to the Eucharist. He talks about in the bread of life discourse, right? Why eat? Our ancestors had manna and so forth, but they ended up getting hungry. So why about that? My kids came in. So I think just constant inculcation helps. And the sermons are the most important thing. Of course, offer classes. The priest can offer classes, just separate things at night about, hey, the Eucharist, so forth, and we'll see who shows up. I think every parish should have adult education classes, especially if there's volunteers, and certainly you can make an emphasis on that during the next 2 years. And I think just that helps. It wouldn't hurt. Yes, every parish having a religious procession through the downtown of whatever town you're in, that couldn't hurt, right? All these things could help. The last thing I want to talk about with the real presence, I would like there to be a greater emphasis on confession, because confession and communion go hand in hand. Here come my kids again. Confession goes hand in hand, of course. Like I've mentioned before, my mother, she has a very thick Mexican accent. When I was young, the lines to confession were long and the lines to Eucharist were short. Now the lines to communion are long and the lines to confession are short. She's right. In most parishes, she's right. So yes, we want there to be a Eucharistic revival. Yes, of course, we want more Catholics to believe in the real presence. And of course, yes, we want more people receiving the spiritual graces, the spiritual food of the Eucharist, if they're in a state of grace. So when this is talked about in the pulpit or in adult education classes or wherever it is, there needs to be the mention. We only receive the Eucharist if A, we're a Catholic. Protestants can't receive it. And we have videos on that here, so we're not going to spend too much time there. But most importantly, we must be in a state of grace. So I think we're almost doing an injustice if we're talking about how important the Eucharist is, but we're not talking about how important confession is. We don't want to drink from the cup of judgment like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11. We need to be in a state of grace to receive the Eucharist. And it's okay if there's a period of time where you're going to Mass and you're not receiving the Eucharist. I did that. If I couldn't go to confession, I'd go to Mass, of course, but I wouldn't receive the Eucharist. And I think we need to instill the importance of confession again, because it's connected to the Eucharist. So please have the Eucharistic revival, but concomitantly, let's have the confession revival as well, because I think they go hand in hand. And I'm going to end the video short because more of my kids are probably going to come in. Guys, post in the comments. Let me know what you think about the Eucharistic revival. If you think the church is doing a good job, have you heard about it on your parochial level? Until next time, take care. God bless and pray.